Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will share strategies that agencies can implement in order to alleviate the concern of the unknown and make operations more efficient. My name is Kirsten Kotzaruba, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and ATARC is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees here today, and a special thanks to Lisa Ragusa Fidela and the rest of the Aqua Security team. This afternoon, we're going to hear from our panelists, where we will have a Q&A session, and we're going to be popping in a few polls as we go. So I just want to encourage the audience at home to submit your questions in the Q&A section of this platform down below, and be sure to respond to the poll questions as well in order to receive your CPE credit. So with all of that said, I'd love to start off with a round of introductions and an opportunity to hear from each of our panelists today. If you could share with us who you are, what agency you represent, and what your role is there, that would be a great way to start off. So let's hear from Elena first.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. My name is Elena Peterson. I am a senior cybersecurity researcher at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is a Department of Energy national laboratory for doing R&D in a number of areas. I lead a lot of R&D efforts around different parts of cybersecurity at the lab, and manage a group of cybersecurity researchers and engineers. And I've been at PNNL for 33 years, my whole career.
Fantastic, thank you. Charles, over to you next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Livingston. I'm a retired naval aviator. I've been a information warfare cybersecurity practitioner for over 35 years now, and I'm currently the cybersecurity risk management branch chief at Health and Human Services. Thanks.
Thank you. Kashif, over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kassa Zemi. I'm the Director of Solution Architect and Cloud Security at Aqua. I have over 20 years of security experience. In the last 10 years, I've been working on API and cloud security. So I lead a team of solution architects within Aqua to help customers secure their environment.
Thank you. And Lucy, you're next.
I'm Lucy Holman. I work for the Federal Aviation Administration. Been there for about 27 years. My job right now is I established a group that oversees cybersecurity, and that's all the way from establishing requirements to solutions to testing for the air traffic organization. So anything that is involved in the movement of aircraft, commercial aircraft, my group is responsible for those systems in terms of cybersecurity.
Very cool. Thank you. And Chris, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Chris Hughes, CISO and co-founder of a company named Aquia, a cybersecurity services company, not to be confused with Aqua, but definitely the similarity is there. But I've been in the career field for about 20 years. I've been active duty Air Force. I've been a federal civilian a couple of times, once with the Navy and once with the FedRAMP team at GSA. And I'm also a cyber innovations fellow at CISA right now, working on SBOM, and actually just published a book called Software Transparency that goes really deep on the topic.
Awesome, thank you. And for those at home, I'm going to do my best to monitor the chat. I see we have some people saying hello, but let's dive into our first question here. And for the panelists, if you want to add anything to this, just go ahead and throw up the raise hand icon. But Lucy, I'd love to start with you first with the question of what is the purpose of software bill of material, otherwise known as SBOM? Could you please share your perspective on that question?
Sure. It's really to understand where all the software that you're putting into your environments, really understanding where it's coming from, how it's been developed, how it's been developed. If you think about things like SolarWinds and how that was able to really cause great impact, negative impact right into the environments, especially the operation.
Thank you. All right, there we go. Thank you, Lucy, for kicking us off there. Is there anyone else from the panel that wants to weigh in on this? Let's go Kashif first.
Yeah, So Melissa, she did a really good job in explaining the whole thing. Just to add to that is, modern software is really complicated, right? It's not what it used to be before. So everyone requires library dependency from internal and external sources. So you really need to know where everything is coming from. You need to have a catalog, an inventory of all the components of your software to understand where everything's coming from. And therefore you could build policy and secure all those components so you avoid a SolarWinds attack.
Thank you. Charles, let's hear from you next.
Well, great explanations by the panelists. I just wanted to add that it's really real popular now. SBOM is real popular with the publishing of OMB Memo 2218 and its follow-on 2316. So it's become a topic du jour as a result of the requirements of SBOM and attestations. The SBOM, it does tell the what. It is a bit challenging as to determine the level of risk, though, related to the software. And so that's an important aspect of it. And attestations are being added to that to help identify that. And that's more to follow and follow on questions.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some good points raised around the panel here. One person talked about, getting it from a software supplier, like we talked about with Charles and the previous person that spoke. It kind of addresses longstanding information, a lack of transparency from suppliers to consumers. And that's why you see the federal government starting to ask for these artifacts. But also, as the individual from Aqua talked about, we use a large part of open source software for 60 to 80% of our modern applications. If you look at things like the Cyber Safety Review Board review of Log4j, federal agencies spent about 30,000 hours in one case trying to figure out where it even existed in the environment. So having a software artifact like an SBOM is going to show you, where you have these components or libraries within your digital landscape and your environments, and kind of save that time. But to Charles' point, it also doesn't necessarily tell you if something's exploitable, reachable, or known to be exploited. And that's where other things like CISA's no exploited vulnerability list, or we're now seeing things like EPSS, the exploit prediction scoring system, and other things come into play to provide that additional context. And also, obviously, it could be part of an attestation, from a supplier to a consumer. So yeah, well said all around.
Yeah, thank you. Elena, I saw your hand up. Did you want to add anything?
I was really just going to add that it can really help you react to a breach of some kind like Log4j, so that you know exactly what software you have that might be affected if that happens, but well said by others.
Yeah, well, Elena, while I have you here, I kind of wanted to bring up the next question too, which is, why is defining whether a piece of software is compliant or not? Would you say that's the best way to go about it, or how would you respond to that question?
Well, compliance is hard. I think for things to just be compliant might actually bring in some complacency, but having some level of compliance to make sure that people are putting together software in ways that make sense, and that we do have SBOMs where we need them so that we can mitigate the risk is important. I think you need something to start with those risk decisions, and that can be a place to get that started. It'll help you beginning to understand the risks that you might be engaging in and getting some software. So there are some pros and cons to defining whether software is truly compliant. What does compliance really mean? Is there one set of compliant regulations? So it's a bit of a can of worms there, but I think it's a decent place to start.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add there before I switch over to some of the audience questions that have come in? Yes, go ahead, Kashif.
Sure. Yeah, exactly what Elena just mentioned. But also, if the software is not compliant, you want to adjust it early on. Whenever there's a problem with any development, you want to adjust it early on, because waiting till a later time, it becomes expensive, and it could be a lot more work to be done. So whatever the issue is, if it's not compliant, whatever the compliance report you're running against, if it's not, you should look into it. You should address it before you go to the next step.
Thank you. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that I did want to add is that standardization of compliance requirements, it really keeps the software vendors all playing by the same rules. Otherwise, what standards are you comparing it to if they aren't using a a standard set of requirements, of compliance requirements.
Thank you. Real quickly, I'm going to call for poll question number 1. And while we've got that up on the screen, panelists, if you could shift your attention over to the audience questions that have come through, we'll try and run through a couple of those if we have some time. For those at home, though, the poll question number 1, we're all at home, but for the audience at home, where do you feel your agency stands on its journey to modernized cloud native security? So just go ahead and send that response in. And then over to audience questions. We had a lot come in, so let me see here. Lucy, you started us off and it looked like Mark Ryan wrote in wanting to know from you, how important or valuable would it be to have visibility of known CVEs early in the DevOps process, as well as within minutes of new CVEs being discovered, their locations, and the remediation? Any of our panelists can weigh in on this, of course, but it looked like it was more directed towards Lucy. Lucy, if you want to share some of your thoughts.
Sure, it's critical, right? So as soon as you find out about any vulnerability, the sooner you know about it, and that, the quicker you can react to it. That's always beneficial. So yes, I mean, understanding and knowing, a known vulnerability as soon as possible is key. So we are always looking at that. I mean, in terms of like even a continuous monitoring type of environment, which we're always trying to get to, trying to understand and react as quickly as possible, having that ingest of information within that operational environment, especially when you're talking about air traffic control. Yes, the sooner that we know about it, the better. And really incorporating even into your risk models that type of information or that way of ingesting that information also becomes very important. So that's a great point and something that definitely everyone should consider as part of their way of defending against known types of vulnerabilities like this.
Thank you. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because it's a hot topic for me. It's definitely critical to know about the CVEs. Obviously, earlier in the SDLC, the better. But we have 200,000 plus CVEs in the National Vulnerability Database, and less than 5% of them are known to be exploited. So it's one thing to know about the vulnerabilities. It's another to actually know if they're exploited currently in the wild or if they're probable, to be exploited in the coming 30 days, for example. Because what SBOM does is it gives us increased transparency that we haven't had into our software historically. And the last thing you want to do is like throw a massive, scanning report over to your development peers and say, hey, sift through this and figure it out. It's not going to make you a lot of friends, and it's not going to build rapport and trust, between security and development teams. So definitely try to provide that additional context if you can.
Thank you, Chris. All right. And then it looks like, let's see, we've got another question from Julius White, wrote in reference to SBOM self-attestation, is there any thought concerning software provider self-attestation validation? Let's go Charles and then Chris after.
This is an issue that I kind of find a little bit interesting. I know it's a starting place. Self-attestation and in the role of cybersecurity, I don't think has a place. It's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, so to speak. However, we need to have a place to start. And that is a starting place. It affords vendors an opportunity to kind of, I don't want to say lay bare, but share what they feel minimizes or mitigates the potential risk that can be seen by using their software, by saying or affirming that we are good. But I'm more so of the mindset of trust but verify, and we need to have a means of validating the attestation, the self-attestation that's independent of the vendors themselves.
Thanks, Charles. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to add, this is obviously a longstanding kind of double-edged sword for us in cybersecurity. For example, I've been on the FedRAMP team in the past, like I mentioned, as a federal employee, and FedRAMP has been around for 10 years. I love my FedRAMP team folks, but it's been around for 10 years. We have, 300 services authorized in the marketplace out of tens of thousands of cloud services because of the third-party attestation angle being a big part of that. So the last thing like we want to do, like Charles talked about, is if we push out right out the gate with a third-party attestation model, it can massively impede the government's access to innovative software services because it's a big bureaucratic, effort and timely and costly, et cetera. But then again, we saw with NIST AR 171, now CMMC, when there's revenue on the line, self-attestation, isn't necessarily a good a mechanism to validate, someone's posture. So I definitely think we need to start with self-attestation and hopefully advance from there to a more mature, attestation model, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Thank you. And Elena, go ahead.
I think that I agree completely. I think of trust but verify, but I think it would be the answer is really going to be in some sort of automation of that, and not the human in the loop sort of verification of these things, which is the direction I think we need to go. Coming from an R&D background.
Thank you. We have probably time for one more question, maybe two. Natalie Carey writes in, how does this conversation shift with codeless technology where the software vendor is managing the code base as a service? How is the government thinking about codeless technology? If any of our government folks could weigh in.
I think, I'll take a swing real quick. I think when she says codeless technology, I think she's likely referring to like no code or low code platforms. Those still have software. It's still software. It's just kind of pre-written software you can take, compose, compile, et cetera. So you're still responsible essentially for what you're compiling there, need to understand what the code is that you're using. And that's why it's really critical to work with, kind of a secure, rigorous, no code, low code platform that does some of that due diligence for you as you're starting to compile those things, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Anyone else, or should I move on to the next question? Go ahead, Lucy.
Yeah, I could just add, so everything is contracts based, right? So from a government standpoint, we'd still require some level of assurances, right? That software, and it's also in the environment that you're talking about. Obviously, there are some areas that are more critical than others. I would think that in our critical services and air traffic environment, we'd still want that visibility and that understanding of what's going on with that code. So yeah, it would very much be dependent on how it's being applied, but it's really in the requirements of the contract that it comes into play.
Yeah, we have a follow-up for Chris based on the comment of the lesser number of CDEs. How valuable would it be to have the ability to have an AI assist on evaluating a CDE to evaluate the potential attack?
I see the question. So it's a lengthy one. Cool. I'll jump in. No, I'm just smirking and laughing because I knew, of course, AI is going to make an appearance here. We can't have a conversation with cybersecurity without AI being part of the conversation. But obviously, we're seeing vendors integrate, kind of these pilot, co-AI type models to help facilitate some of the activities that we do in cybersecurity. Like, I think it was Lucy who talked about automation, or it might have been Elena, I'm sorry, automation and removing the human in the loop. And that's where AI is going to come into play. It's like we don't simply have the manpower, to go and identify these issues. It take too many hours to try and do this at scale across every software supplier, every application. Automation is going to play a key part for sure.
Thank you. All right, and then I think we might have time for one more. William Wong, is software that is developed in the U.S. the only software allowed in the U.S. government, or is software developed by allies not allowed? I see heads shaking. All right, there you go. You got your answer.
We get our software from everywhere. Yes.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for that. I'm going to call for poll question number 2, and then we'll jump back into my questions for the time being. So poll question number 2, how confident are you that you have the tools necessary in figuring out the next steps to develop or further enhance your organization's cloud native security? So please respond to that. And then jumping back into my questions, let's see. Kashif, maybe you can start us off with this next one. I want to know what supporting processes are needed in order to satisfy the SBOM purpose on an operational level, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Every organization is different. Every group is different, right? But the main thing is you need to be able to integrate with your software development lifecycle. So, that means integrating with your SCM, your source code management, your pipeline, your registries, or whatever tool that you have. The solution that's providing the SBOM needs to be able to integrate with it so you can automate the process and you have full visibility in the SDLC, really.
Thank you. Let's go, Chris, and then Elena.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I really like this question because it's kind of pointing out what several of the panelists have pointed out here is that, SBOM is not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, it's a great starting point, but agencies need to have a process as well as tools and technologies to ingest, receive, analyze, enrich, report on the findings from the SBOM. Without that, it's merely just an artifact, and you have to institutionalize it into your procurement processes, your risk management, your cybersecurity program. So it's not a panacea, and I really like that question because it emphasizes that.
Great, thank you. Elena, go ahead.
So I was going to add that training and education, it's new. And so it's not necessarily part of the ecosystem that we have in training cybersecurity workforce or even in the current workforce and what we call our sponsors, the folks that we work for. So a lot of training and education about the importance, the need, how they're done, why they should be done, et cetera. It's just an additional factor.
Charles, go ahead.
Sure, I just wanted to add that SBOMs without attestation is you're kind of partly loading up your weapons for execution. So you need that validation of the potentiality of risk. And so not self-attestations, which is really counterintuitive to zero trust, but software attestations themselves associated with your SBOMs. It's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. There was another audience question too, asking, I guess, clarification. Brianne O'Brien writes in, isn't self-attestation what NIST 800, 171 and the SSP, POAM and SAR is in essence that it tries to achieve? So maybe if one of our panelists could respond to that. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Initially, we did go down the path of 800 171, a self-attestation model, but then software suppliers, government suppliers in the defense industrial base, were still falling victim to things that theoretically had been attested to being done and in place. And that's why we've seen it mature to the cybersecurity maturity model, CMMC, which has a third-party attestation angle to it. So now there's going to be a third party that will come and validate that these things are done. So the self-attestation model, like Charles and others have mentioned, trust but verify. We had the trust part, but the verification part was missing, and now we're closing the gap there.
Charles, go ahead.
Also, it's interesting that two recent OMB memos requiring self-attestation of vendor software is still in play. And that's unfortunate, I think, in that the lessons learned from what Brianne is asking in her question, it's not being applied to the memos because, again, and it's almost self-attestation almost gets me to pull out my soapbox, so to speak, and stand on top of it. I don't think it has long-term a role. I mean, it's a good start, but then you base that information on its accuracy and you validate it from maybe a third party, and then in that way, then you can have the outcome you're seeking for in terms of attestation in and of itself.
Thank you, Charles. Anyone else on this topic before I jump back to my questions? Okay, cool. Elena, maybe you could start us off on this next one. I want to know, how time-consuming do you think it is to implement the SBOM process within an organization, or how do you feel like this process could be streamlined?
So, I think it's going to be different for any and all enterprises based on size, the amount of software that they use, their risk, their need for risk management. So that's hard to say, to quantify. But I think really the streamline of the process comes from automation and tools to help generate SBOMs. One of the things we talk about is, as software is generated, it gets an SBOM. Great. What about the software we've been using for decades and is still out there? So how do we generate SBOMs? How do we verify them, but in an automated fashion? If we do all of this with humans in the loop, we'll never catch up and we'll never get there. And so the time consuming it would be extreme. So automation, continuous integration tools are starting to generate SBOM information in their build cycles. That's a good thing, as long as we can rely on them. But also perhaps other tools that could detect whether or not software that you're getting has SBOM information, verified SBOM information in it, not allowing folks to use those tools if they don't, is another sort of streamlined process, so you're not finding out after the fact. So some of those are my thoughts.
Thank you. I saw Charles' hand go up first. Go ahead, Charles.
Well, I think initially the great point about automation, first of all. Without automation, you couldn't have any type of discussion in terms of reducing time. But I think initially it is going to be time consuming. Overall, though, I think an economy of effort, especially across the federal workspace for collaboration, is really important. So we have a Fed-wide repository. And in that way, you know, the fruits of the efforts for the individual agencies are collected, and it is managed by one agency, which I think is the plan, is the direction for OMB Memo 2218 and 2316, that CISA is going to be the master repository manager for all of our SBOM. Now that's the plan. And we have to have a plan to deviate from. So I understand that, but at least there's a plan moving forward. And so I think that will be very helpful. So then we can then tap that centralized repository for federal workspace, and then use that as a means of not having to regenerate and rework things that some other agencies already done and should be part of this master repository.
All right, Kashif, you are up next.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so the time consuming part is not really technically that time consuming as long as you have the right tools to do it. So the software vendors, our side, ARCA being one, they make it really, really easy. It takes literally like a minute or so for you to integrate with your SCM and your registry and whatnot. And working with other teams with DevOps, it takes maybe total 2 to 3 minutes. There's no way you would be able to do this something on your own, but manually. You know, I wouldn't want my worst enemy to be able to go through it manually, figure out what this is, right? It's not possible. And then if someone does do it manually, I wouldn't trust it. Where there's too much, the software these days are too big, there's too many dependencies, too many libraries, you will miss a lot. So you really need an automation tool to do it. And once the automation tool is in place, it's literally, you know, minutes to spit out an SBOM.
Thank you. Thank you. Chris.
I'm actually going to defer to Lucy. I've rambled quite a bit. I'll go after she does if we have time.
Sure.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I mean, to me, some of the time investment is really around being able to get to those decision makers and government environment. You know, getting monies and funding is typically the hard part of sometimes doing this. And right now, when you're talking about cybersecurity, there are so many things that are hitting them. You talk about zero trust, you talk about AI, you talk about quantum computing. And so you're hitting a lot of these, you know, executives and decision makers with a lot of technical terminology that they may not necessarily be able to easily discern where is the priority. So when we're talking about streamlining, I would really think from a different perspective. How do we streamline what we're trying to do overall into an overall strategy that includes some of this, so that we're not bombarding, right, with all these different types of technologies that we're trying to introduce them to be able to make that so that it is something that is bought into and it is something that is funded. Because again, from a time consuming standpoint, if you don't have the money, doesn't matter how much time you can actually spend on it, you're not going to go anywhere with it. So to me, investing the time to ensure that you're giving the decision makers the right type of information overall is definitely worth investment in terms of time.
Thanks, Lucy. Chris, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say really exceptionally well said by the panel here. I like a lot of the points made. Charles kind of touched on the concept of reciprocity so that we're not kind of asking every single individual software vendor for this artifact over and over and over across n number of agencies. That would be a lot of toil on their part and the agency's part. So it could save time having that centralized repository that folks can go to. But as he said, that's the plan. As we know in government, things don't always go toward according to plan. And then Lucy pointed out a really great thing is that there's a lot of things coming from the cybersecurity executive order, national cyber strategy, a lot of competing priorities, when it comes to budgetary constraints and cognitive limitations among, our teams here. So definitely keep that in mind in terms of how long it'll take. And the last thing I'll add is every agency is a little bit different. Some agencies are producing more software internally, others are procuring more software externally, for example. So it won't look the same for every agency. It really depends on what they're doing around software consumption and development and so on.
Thank you. So we have a little more time left to look back at the audience questions. I saw quite a few new ones come through here. So let's start with Brianna O'Brien writes in, wants to know what tools are available to secure the content of the SBOM. That's question number one, if anyone wants to respond to that.
My hand's up, so I'll go. I wouldn't necessarily point to a single tool. It's more fundamental security practices around access control, permission, permission management, implementing obviously zero trust principles when it comes to our architecture and our environments, ensuring people with a need to know have access, only those individuals, for example, only for the certain providers that maybe they need to have visibility of, and implementing things like, fundamental role-based access control and so on is going to be key there. Obviously, you want to store it in a secure location, whether it's a third-party location or self-hosted environment that has things like encryption and things like that in place. But there's no single tool per se. It's more fundamental security practices around proper storage and safekeeping.
Great. I should say too, if you guys see any questions that stick out to you, don't feel like you need to wait for me to call on you. You can just go ahead and jump into it. But Kashif, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there are tools, right? Like Aqua Security, this is what we do, right? We secure your build, we secure the image, we make sure that the image and the workload that is running is what it was, and it doesn't change, it doesn't jump. This is exactly what we do, and there are many tools like this, and Aqua is one of them. So for sure, there are tools.
Yeah, Elena, go ahead.
And there's starting to be developed tools for verifying SBOMs. So if there is some worry that they've been modified in some way or attacked in some way, there's tools that can verify them. So we're working on developing some of these.
Yeah. What about the question from Dr. Prentice Norman? Does the SBOM also ensure the integrity of the software build?
No, the SBOM is kind of the end artifact that you're getting as an output of the software development process, but that's where things like NIST Secure Software Development Framework, SALSA for folks familiar with that, other guidance from agencies like NSA, NIST, CNCF, kind of on the commercial industry front, things that are looking at more into the build process, the software development lifecycle, and so on. The SBOM is essentially the output at the end. It doesn't tell you how much integrity was involved in the actual development of the software.
Right.
Yep. Kashif, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. That's by itself doesn't do it, but tools, external tools, where you could work with, that would cross-reference the software artifact and make sure that integrity is fine and it doesn't change. So we could definitely do that. But SBOM in itself doesn't, but other tools that generate the SBOM would be able to do something like that.
Right. I like this question from, where did it go? I think it was PJ Smith. SBOMs give you the visibility into vulnerabilities that might be in your current environment, but how do teams set internal policies or guardrails to make sure that developers are using better component and vulnerability management from the beginning? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a tricky one because you don't want to stifle development and innovation at the agency, kind of bogging down every single component decision around using an open source software component. But there are innovative tools and solutions out there that start to kind of shift left of giving the developer insight into the software, open source software components they're integrating in their products, understand if it has CVEs, is it well maintained? Is it how many people are contributing to the project, et cetera, kind of leading indicators of risk too beyond CVE. But I think we have a long way to go as an industry, not just on the federal front, but across the industry when it comes to kind of maturing our practice around open source software consumption.
Thank you. Elena, go ahead.
Yes, I have two things. One, I love the implication of this question because the implication is, will SBOM solve all our problems? No. And for all the reasons that Chris just said. But the other thing is that there's a lot of push right now for what CISA calls at least secure by design. And I think that's a good step in moving forward in protecting our software, not just from the SBOM side, but from building better, more secure software from the actual design phase. So that's, I think, also a step forward for us. Long ways to go.
Thank you. Kashif, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I used to be a developer many years ago in my previous life, right? So I would develop software as quickly as possible. I wouldn't care about anything else until someone banged me on my head and said, hey, this is bad. Go fix this, right? Then you will stop and think about what the problem is and you will fix it. So the way you get the teams the developers to understand that this is a problem, you let them know, like it should generate a report like, hey, this build of yours has these vulnerabilities. And if you upgrade this package to this version, it removes that vulnerability. So as long as they're aware, there's an automated way to make them aware that they put a build through, the build fails. It failed. Why did it fail? Because it had these vulnerabilities. Go fix its vulnerabilities, and then you could rebuild. Push your build again, and it should work fine as long as you rectify those issues. As long as they're notified and they're aware of the issue, the developers will fix it. So, long-winded answer, but yes, your developers could know as long as it's within the process and they get notified.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, and the next one I see, but again, if the panelists, if you guys see anything that really sticks out, you want to answer it, feel free to just raise your hand and respond to it directly. But I kind of like this question. Robert Lulis writes in, any thoughts on extending the SBOM metadata to include the individual contributors of the software containing the CVE, including historical versions of the code base contributions? Elena, I see your hand up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is an issue that we're dealing with in some of our work for the Department of Energy, including this kind of information along with vulnerability information in the SBOM itself. It's a bit different than what a lot of folks doing SBOMs are doing, but there are some of our sponsors that are very interested in tying all of this information together in one place. I think it's probably a set of debates that we'll have for a little while before we settle on an answer. But it's definitely something that we're looking at.
Thank you.
I was just going to add on that topic, on one hand, I understand kind of from the security perspective why you would want maybe the contributor name, but as folks who understand like the software ecosystem likely know, especially in the open source ecosystem, many times these are provided by folks with, pseudonyms or just usernames that represent a real individual. So just, providing that information alone doesn't necessarily give you any kind of assurance around who they are or what their intentions are, but there are organizations that provide information on their history. For example, what other projects have they contributed to? What other activities have they done that may be nefarious? For example, where are they coming from a geolocation perspective, which obviously isn't always safe because you can use US-based software to conduct malicious activities, for example. But it's another thing to consider as part of your broader risk management approach, I think.
Kashif?
Yeah, I think Chris got it on the head on that one, right? So if you look at this open source, you can really understand who the end developer, there are many developers there. But I read the question a little bit different, right? So you have the software open source, you bring it in-house, the developer internally uses our software. And if you want to be able to correlate that vulnerability or issue back to that developer, that is possible. We could find that out. You get the whole, the whole life cycle, like a security map, like this is the issue. And this is the push, and this is the developer who actually made that code change. So we could find that out. But for the open source, Chris really got it. You really won't be able to figure that out effectively. But internally, yes, you should be able to find out who the developer is, and then you could go back to them and try to have them rectify the issue.
Thank you. And Charles?
Yeah, so it was a question by Leopold Waldenauer, if I pronounced your name correctly. And it's regarding M2218, now superseded by 2316, but requiring agencies to inventory all deployed software and break out critical software. This was interesting because for many of us who are depending on the CDM program and its reporting capabilities to provide that information, in some cases, we're waiting for that to mature to the point of being able to report that out. For my agency's case in particular, there was FSMA reporting requirements, FSMA metrics for FY20. See, it came out in September of last year. So it's FY22 that asked the question about critical software, but it didn't break out the name. It just gave you a number. So I got a number of over 500 critical software items with no names. And so I had to circle around, and this became, unfortunately, a manual activity. Had to turn around and develop a couple of data calls for the operating divisions to identify that more specifically. Now, the automation piece is the CDM reporting that we're waiting for it to come into full maturation. So that's how it was approached, because we had numbers but not names, and then we had validation from the operating divisions to identify that actual software to marry up with the numbers. And then that's how we developed our critical software list. It's not the best way to run a business, but when asked the question and you need a bottom line, we were able to get that bottom line. It took us a little bit to do it, though.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. All right, anyone else before I transition over to our final poll? All right, cool. Third poll up on the screen, please. What are your plans for mitigating risk for your agency's software supply chain in the coming year? So please respond to that. And then I am going to ask our last question here. If we have time, we can chip away at some more audience. But basically, I want to know, and Lucy, maybe you can start us off here. There are different formats of SBOM. Do you feel like there is a need to choose one in terms of compliance? And if so or not, what are the advantages or disadvantages of going with one over another?
So I think it's going to be really dependent, again, on the environment that you're talking about, because obviously there's different types. Popular ones are like using standards like the Cyclone DX or the SPDX. But to me, if you look into those different types of standards, it's really, how granular do you need to be? How much information are you requiring? Again, it's very dependent on the environment that you're in. Obviously, for your more critical types of services, you would probably want to get or use something that has a high level of granularity and visibility into that. But typically we don't prescribe too much in what's to be used, but really kind of go around the requirements of what the expectation and the type of information that we're looking for from that perspective. So that's kind of the answer that I have for the moment.
Thank you. Elena, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, it's a hot topic. We've had debates, both even nationally and internationally, whether or not the format should be fixed for SBOMs. In particular, our debate is often around whether or not vulnerability information should be in the SBOM directly, and does that fit the format? So it's a tough question, because it's great for interoperability and tool integration if they're all the exact same format, but a little tough, like Lucy said, to maybe add the kinds of information you might need in the context of your environment. So I doubt that we'll end up with one hardcore formats, because we're the most part for the government, we don't end up in those spaces. But it would be good if we could do something like we've done with threat information management with STIX and TAXI, where there is a language around how you convey the information, and then the formats can be augmented based on that language. And there might be a way to sort of abstract a way of integrating this data without requiring a hard and set format for it.
Thank you. Kashif, I think I saw your hand next.
Yep. As Lucy mentioned, the two main formats, Cyclone DX and SPDX. What I tell our customers is just choose one or the other and make sure you stick with it and you just standardize on it. Which one should we choose? It depends on what you're looking for. What is your end? Where are you pushing the report to make sure that it integrates well with it? So whatever it is, just choose one or the other, and your whole organization should just stick to that one. It'll make it a lot easier for for everyone if you just choose one format.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I think, it's been well said around the table here in terms of, kind of rallying around a format that works best for you. But I'll say, as a consumer, like for an agency, you're going to receive both depending on your supplier base. Having tooling in place that can read either one is going to be critical. And a lot of the modern tools are starting to be able to kind of interchangeably work with either formats. I would think the bigger thing, rather than just a line in the sand on one format or the other, is the elements within the SBOM, rallying around what elements within the SBOM will make it informative and actionable for you from a risk management perspective. Things like the NTIA minimum elements for an SBOM, for example, things like that. But I think we're here. I think we're going to see both formats, continue to exist for some time. And honestly, maybe it's good. It's healthy competition to drive our SBOM format processes and such forward.
Thank you. And Charles?
I agree, particularly what Chris was saying here. When you look more at the content of the SBOM itself, and less about the format, as the goal seems to be to try to be one size fits all, and I'm not a subscriber to that per se, but many times we have to respond to those requirements, and in doing so, what NISTs provide as a basic simple format, one of the three main formats of SBOMs, the SWID format, that may be the basic one, and may not be helpful for many agencies that are looking for more specificity in the helping to identify risk and vulnerability. But we need to start somewhere, and so if we can provide at least from a simplistic perspective, that this is the basic information we have in an SBOM, and if you want to build more specificity within that, that's great. But at least we know we can look across all federal workspace and see that we all have the same basic information. So that's a great starting place. Without it, then it's very difficult if we wanted to collaborate. It's difficult if agency X is using one format, and then agency Y if Y is using SPDX, then it makes it difficult because you're talking apples and oranges. So I would just say that perhaps it might be helpful if we can at least establish a baseline across the federal workspace, and then we work from there to see how it needs to be customized depending upon what the agency's specifically needs are.
Thank you. Elena, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think that's spot on. In order to be able to share information, we have to be able to talk to each other. From an R&D point of view too, there's lots of tools that could be developed that would convert one to the other, make sure all the formats could be ingested as long as there's not too many of them. But I think the theme is really great, is that the content, the main set of content, should be in there regardless of the technical format of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We may have time for one more audience cue. I think maybe this is a good one to kind of wrap up with. How does the White House AI Bill of Rights affect SBOM activities? Any thoughts on that?
I'll say I'm not an expert on the White House Bill of Rights, so I'm not going to try to speak out of turn there. But I will say here with CISA, for example, we've been emphasizing that AI is ultimately a software system or software underlying those systems, and needs SBOMs and transparency as well as the broader software ecosystem. But definitely defer to someone else on that particular artifact.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it wasn't the best one to end. That's okay. Let's see, in developing, well, Charles, you kind of touched on this too, but I'll just open it up to everyone. But in developing a universal SBOM, there obviously needs to be a balance between striving for secure software baseline versus stifling innovation and competition through overregulation. Just this person writes in wanting to know where you kind of draw the line on that. Anyone?
I would
It's
offer that the most important piece here is managing the risk, and so in trying to manage the risk, there's some helpful outcomes to competition, and in which really help spur on innovation. But it has to be tempered with what is the risk appetite for your specific organization. If you can tolerate a little bit more risk, then you probably can deal with a little bit more innovation. There's some agencies though that have a low risk tolerance, and so you're just not going to see that much. And that's not something that we can universally say is going to be applied across the federal workspace, because it depends on the agencies. And some of their mission critical information is just too risky. Let me rephrase. The risk tolerance is too low to really look to see how you can optimize this.
Thank you. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think Charles hit it on the head that every agency, every organization has different risk tolerance. I'll just add, as a long-time, cybersecurity professional and have been a federal employee a couple of times myself, we often overemphasize the downside of risk from a cybersecurity perspective, but we also need to think about the risk to the business, the organization, the mission when it comes to failing to innovate as well, because that can have impeded outcomes for, citizens using our services, mission owners, warfighters on the defense front, et cetera. So, it is a dichotomy of balancing that risk and trying to get our desirable outcomes, and it's tough. There's no perfect answer to that question.
Well, go ahead.
I just said well said.
Oh,
Yep.
well said. Yes. Well, thank you all so much. And the audience at home, we had really great questions come in, but it is time for our wrap up key takeaways. So you each have a minute to a minute and a half to kind of share what it is that you want to leave our audience with based on this discussion that we had today. So Lucy, maybe we can start with you and then we'll just go around.
Sure. One point was, again, trying to streamline how we can actually come up with one strategy overall in terms of a cybersecurity standpoint when we are trying to at least embed or ingrain or incorporate a lot of these different types of capabilities into our areas. So the more that we do that, the better. And their business cases are important when we are developing that as well. The other point too that I wanted to make is from a government standpoint, lots of times obviously we depend on NIST, the 853 Revs 5 is the latest, right? And so we use a lot of those controls to really do our assessments, in an organization or in the air traffic environment where you've got over 180 different types of systems, that gets, pretty intense. So to me, sometimes though, one of the things that we do have to remember is that even going beyond, right, what's specified in the NIST family of controls and putting in requirements that, especially when we're talking about things like SBOM, where we're still a little bit nascent in it. So even if the exact control isn't there, putting in requirements that at least starts us down the path of evaluating the different types of vendors, because it does take a while, right, to even incorporate or change contracts or incorporate it into new contracts, et cetera. So starting there, at least you can, again, going beyond what's just in your typical family of controls when you're looking at NIST, I think will help in terms of setting you up later on or as we move forward in trying to tackle, again, especially when you're talking about huge numbers of systems and services and software that's associated with that to hopefully eventually get to where you need to, especially when we're talking about SBOM. I think.
Thanks, Lucy. And let's go to Elena next.
Yeah, so I think that some of the themes that I've gotten from this is that SBOMs are important. They're a great advancement, but they're not a silver bullet. There's still a lot of work to be done. They're not going to solve all the problems in this space. And then additionally, sort of no, there's not one size that fits all kind of solution. I think one of the things that we've pointed out is all the organizations are a little different, all the agencies are a little different. And so how we create regulations and how we meet those needs are all going to take different solutions, not just one. So those are the two kind of key points I thought we said here.
Yeah, thank you. Charles, let's hear from you next, please.
I definitely agree that one size doesn't fit all. And that's so important, although the federal government tends to try to have a cookie cutter approach and everybody do this one thing. And so we have to kind of push back on that in the sense of what makes the most sense. If we're really managing risk, what makes the most sense? SBOM is not a panacea. So we definitely, it is a good tool, but it can't be used in a vacuum. Automation and attestation is really important. Third-party attestation in particular is very important in support of SBOMs. And finally, we need to find a starting place. The crawl, walk, run approach is a well-established approach that we can do to build on the small successes into bigger ones.
Thank you. And Kashif, let's hear from you next.
Oh, thank you. I will just answer some questions from the chat as well. Throughout this whole conversation, we know that SBOM is important, but it is not the end of all, right? So what I want to give back to everyone is, it's a good start. You should know where your components are coming. It's very important to understand where all the dependency libraries, everything is coming from, so you have a record of it. But you also have to look at the bigger picture from code to supply chain, all the way to runtime. Like you need security in all those aspects, right? So you just can't just concentrate on one and forget about the other. You won't be secure. So when you think about securing your software, it's the whole shebang from the code to runtime is what you should really look at. And just keep in mind, when I was a developer before, it was easy to develop code. I mean, it wasn't easy, but it was much smaller and easier to develop. Now you have hundreds and hundreds of different components coming together, working together. So it's becoming more and more challenging. So you really need to invest in some automation tools to help you secure the whole life cycle, really.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reemphasize everything that has been said here. As they said, SBOM is not a panacea. The big thing I would stress for the listeners, the audience here, is like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We're on a journey here, around software supply chain security, much like we are with Zero Trust. I'll say that SBOM helps bring transparency, and I'll say, transparency is foundational to trust. So, we can't really move towards a more mature posture without having that level of transparency, and just keep going down the path. And like I said, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our panelists and the audience at home for writing in. I think this is probably the most questions we've ever had on a webinar. So, I wish we'd probably need like 3 hours to get through all of them. So we'll have to have a follow-up. But of course, we want to thank our partners at Aqua Security for making this possible today. And we have our next event will be up on the screen here shortly. So if you enjoyed this content, you may be interested in the next one, which is America's Software Supply Chain and How Secure Are We? So you can go and you can go register for that on our website there as well. But yeah, it's been a really wonderful hour. Thank you all so much. I really appreciated getting to hear from each of you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.